So you'd say it's perhaps exaggerated, or you've often referred to the age of hyperbole in terms of the fact that there may have been in the past a perceived golden age of things like capitalism, for example, and now that's under attack, or in the past a perceived optimism during the space age, which maybe has been in decline. But you think it's hyperbolic?
I think something really bad is happening. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think it is a reversion to the old things. It's some of the ideologies are the same as old ideologies, but the mechanisms that again, I don't know if you'll see the relevance of this, but the mechanisms that get people cancelled for saying anti-woke things are not the same as the ones that used to get them cancelled. And even when those things were in force, Darwin was utterly devastated by the death of his daughter. And that was a normal thing at the time. Everyone else thought it was normal. Everyone else thought he was exaggerating when he was taking it too hard. And he never went to church from then on. And his family would go to church and he would wait outside. He didn't get any personal backlash for that because a gentleman who was an academic could do what he thought right. And there was no mechanism to force him to do what everyone else was doing. And I think the thing that is causing trouble now is it's not that we're losing freedom of speech. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm not sure how to describe what's happening. The mechanism is new. Some of the ideas are old, but they've always been around. People are talking about how England is going down the drain, but England in 1945 basically voted in communism, and the Attlee government nationalized everything, controlled everything. It had absolutely no chance of sinking the project of Britain. And in fact, as I keep reminding people, it was Attlee who persuaded the Americans to join NATO. So these were functionally communists, but they were violently anti-Soviet. In other words, they were violently pro-British. They believed in the British institutions. They just had various wrong ideas about the economy, so they wanted to implement, which is a very British thing to do. Like I often say, the systems that are good at error correction make larger errors. And those errors, some of them anyway, the major ones, were corrected.
As long as you don't change the system itself to stop error correction. So there are people who try to hack the system itself. And I think that is a problem with giving complete power to one side for any number of years if they start making systemic changes so that they will not leave power.
Yeah, so we have to use the secondary methods of error correction to stop them making systemic changes. The last few governments, both Labour and Conservative, have made changes to the British Constitution, which I think are very perverse and going the wrong way. But there's also the fact that the real British Constitution is in people's minds, and the governments can't change those.
They try to control the media. And it's interesting because now people talk about how the media is controlled, but I think the media has always been controlled. It's just now we have alternative media, so we can see that more clearly.
Yep.
So it's more is being revealed than being changed. You mentioned that the most anti-rational memes exist in the system of education that we have. And it's a modern system, right? Before the Prussians and Napoleon, you didn't have mandatory public education, for example. In your mind, what is the right way to educate people?
So first of all, that only the superficial meaning of institution. Universal schools and that kind of thing is a relatively recent thing. But the bucket theory of the mind has existed since prehistory. And it started improving. So Popper came along and contradicted it. No one has noticed, but he came along and contradicted it in the mid-20th century. But education had been improving before that, for 100 years before that, because these anti-rational memes conflict with the general culture, which had been improving by leaps and bounds through the 19th century and the scientific revolution and so on. The actual practices of making children sit in rows and recite things by heart and hit them when they don't. That has changed. But the underlying theory of what it's all supposed to do is exactly the same as it was in prehistoric times. The idea is that we want to make sure that the next generation get the knowledge that we have in our culture faithfully, because that's what knowledge is. It's information that's poured into you, and anything that's not faithful is going to be an error, because almost all deviations from the true theory are going to be false. And so that just doesn't take into account that this process of transfer is not a process of copying or pouring. It's a process that happens inside the recipient and is about the recipient trying to pick and choose between the stuff he sees and trying to make sense of it, trying to make sense of what it's for, and including moral theories and everything, not just factual theories. So once you realize that it's that way around and it's got to be that way around, then you can begin to see that existing educational practices are, from the point of view of the bucket theory of the mind, are the same as they've always been, and it needs to be changed. And yeah, so it just occurs to me now that the ways it's changed are not really educational. They have been because the general culture has got less punitive and been about welfare rather than duty and that kind of thing. People have got the idea that, yeah, you've got to pour it all in faithfully, but you've got to be nice about it. You can't be mean. But the whole thing is measured at the end of the day by the exam, which tells you what percentage of the stuff that was poured in you actually allowed in.
Okay, so the conditions at the prison might have improved.
Yeah,
but
greatly.
Okay, but as a parent, we're all terrified by the idea that our kids might grow up not speaking the language, not knowing the mathematics, and just playing with spiders in the corner and be unfit for anything other than agricultural work. So what do we do?
You should mention language, but speaking one's native language and walking are two things that are not taught in our culture and never have been, I think. And nobody says, some quote from an educational theorist that says that if children were taught to walk in school, then they'd be 10 years old and still not able to walk. Half of them would be. And the other half wouldn't have learnt it in class. And that's true of everything. So one problem is that this idea of not having an agenda for how they should be, how they should turn out, is very counterintuitive, because the prevailing theory is not just wrong philosophy or the bucket theory of the mind. It also goes against cultural practices. If a child doesn't go to school and meets other children, and they're going to say, "Oh, you don't go to school, that's nice, but what's 7 and 5?" And then your child is going to say, "I don't know and I don't care." And you are going to be embarrassed, and you are going to find it difficult not to be, and not to pass that on to your children. By the way, the vast majority of those improvements, not just in school but in parenting as well, were done by left-wing people, which is ironic, because their theory of what should be done in the wider culture was always harmful. But their influence on educational theory and practice has been almost everything good that's happened in education in the last 100 years has been done by leftists. And they thought they were undermining society. You would say to them, if you don't beat children into conformity, then how will they work in factories? The right-wing people would say. And the left-wing people would say, that's exactly what we're trying to do. They were wrong, because they were wrong about everything except their educational theory. So that it's not that they thought that culture could be transmitted better and also improved by not forcing it. They thought that culture was bad and shouldn't be transmitted. That was why they did all their good things. And now that this process is pretty much spent, that like you can't make the classrooms any more pastel colored, and you can't speak to the children in nicer ways.
When I try to explain a more libertarian view of how learning works, it's learning just is knowledge creation.
Creation, exactly.
And so what Popper writes about in how science and knowledge broadly is generated is what's going on in the mind of the learner. And it just seems to be a logical line to draw that if Popper begins with the project of science is you start with a problem, then obviously any mandated curriculum, even no matter how liberal you want your curriculum to be and choice, you're handing the student either problems or worse still, the solutions to problems. And as you say, or I don't know if you're quoting Popper when you say answers to questions not asked. That's like the purpose of...
quoting Popper, that one.
But if we go to the 7+5 example, that has practical value as well. If the kid doesn't know how to do 7+5, they'll have a hard time navigating our society, which punishes innumeracy.
So that's not true. They will have a hard time, or rather they will have a problem when they encounter something like how many shoes can they fit in their wardrobe or whatever. Once they have that problem and they're free, they will solve it like that. It's not hard. It's not hard learning to add up or learn multiplication tables. Like if you know a few facts, you notice that 5 5s are 25. If you know that, then you can easily work out what 6 5s are.
Like I grew up in India partially, and it was a given that the people who are uneducated had no chance. And yes, some of them might be because they weren't in the right institutions, they didn't make the right connections, they weren't offered the right jobs. But some of us, they literally had no chance because the only reality they knew was by some point, okay, now I have to start making a living. It's too late to learn mathematics and accounting. Now I'm just going to have to carry a bucket full of cement on my head for the rest of my life. And I'm just trapped into that situation.
It could be that society is arranged in such a way that it only allows people to make progress if they, as my friend used to say, if they bear certain scars. It's not that the scars are functional, but they are like a shibboleth or whatever. Mm-hmm. However, I think of the counterexamples. One can learn coping mechanisms. It's supposed to be that you learn the prerequisites in year 5, you learn the prerequisites for year 6, and in year 6 you learn, but it's not true. If you didn't go to year 5 but enter year 6, you catch up in no time. And similarly, being tested for how well you can read stops at age 11 or something. And from then on, you're no longer faced with the situation of read that out loud because the teacher will just assume you can. And you have coping mechanisms you have a textbook and the teacher says, do the exercises on page 11. And you find now these ways are so painful and unpleasant that most people just knuckle down and learn the stuff by heart, disabling themselves in the process.
So what does your school look like? Is it everyone just stays at home and does what they want? Do they gather? Do they have options? Do they get offered
in my ideal
instruments?
World, everybody does something different. There is no standard thing that children do. There will be things that a lot of children do, still not all, but there are things that a lot of children do at a certain age, in a certain culture. Like if Steven Spielberg produces a new adventure film, then maybe I'm out of date now because people watch it on video. But at the time when Steven Spielberg was making his blockbuster films, 90% of the children in a town would go there and they would sit quietly while the film played, and then they would go out. And there was no roll call at the beginning, and at the end there was no test, but they all were excitedly speaking about the film and variants of it that they would like to see, and some of them became film directors and so on. And even somebody who's a genius enough to attract 90% of the children in a culture to come to his event, even it doesn't have the genius to make the children do that every day. So that's how far away the school paradigm is from what could and should be. And now I guess I could say, the commenting on recent threads on X, nearly all children want an iPhone. Not all, nearly all. And no, there's no iPhone curriculum. There's nothing like that. They do it because it's a rational mean. They think it will benefit them. And so people then try to explain that, because if they couldn't explain that one thing, never mind the other million things, if they just couldn't explain that one counterexample, their whole educational philosophy would fall apart. So they have to say, A, it's bad for them, and B, it is caused by coercion, namely the coercion of addiction. It causes dopamine. Wait a minute, dopamine is involved in all pleasure, right? Never mind that. Or pleasure is bad, right? We all agree with that. Everybody has problems. Children have problems. They grow up having problems. They all have different problems. They try to solve them. They're powerless, and that's what parents and society are for, to allow them to solve easily soluble problems so they can get on to deep, interesting problems. So easily soluble problems is like having enough food to eat, and difficult problems are the problems that you mentioned. India. I saw a documentary about, it was about electricity or something. It was about children. Was it in India? Anyway, somewhere where the children in the evening go out and sit under the street lamps in order to learn. And oh yes, so there's another example. I've probably told you, because one of my favorite examples in Douglas's autobiography, and I haven't been able to find this passage, and I'm told it's because he wrote several autobiographies and they overlap. And I haven't been able to find the right one, but he described how he learned to read. Slave children learning to read was illegal. Not for the slaves, it was illegal to teach them to read. And there were people who would clandestinely teach so that there were these teenage boys who'd been working in the fields to the maximum extent that you can be forced to work in a field. Then they came home, and then they slunk off to this lady's house where she would be teaching them to read. And if she had been caught, she would have gone to prison, and they would have been whipped. So then he escaped, and he got to the north, and he made a great success. Now I always think, what a terrible tragedy. There were these teenage boys who were willing to risk a whipping and to go to these lessons when they were already exhausted, physically exhausted from over hard working. And today, their descendants are thought to have a low IQ or be perverse and not want that. And anyway, one way or another, they have to be forced into the school to learn. And their ancestors were exactly the other way around. And I think their ancestors were how humans are. That is how humans are. Not just black and white, not just teenagers and adults, but all humans. So probably those Frederick Douglass and his pals who went to that lady's house were not all the slaves. Probably some of them didn't go because they didn't want to. They thought, well, we'd better get a good night's rest instead. And maybe that was best for them. Who can decide that better than them? Somebody ought to make a movie about this, by the way, because Frederick Douglass is absolutely brilliant in every way. It's just a little thing. I can imagine them talking, the ones that went to learn to read, and they would say it completely opens your eyes to a different world if you can read. And they would say, yeah, but I'm tired. And if you meet Steven Spielberg, tell him,